Hello. I know it's been a few weeks since I've posted one of these videos. Things have just been really getting hectic this time of the semester. We also did not have spring break, so that's usually the week that I catch up on everything while most of you are just relaxing. So that I did not really account for that. So I apologize if I've been a little absent. Kind of forgot that I needed to make this Q&A video for last week's discussion. So here I am, 8 p.m. uh, doing this. So I apologize. Before I answer the questions that you all posed in last week's discussion about the ethnography assignment, I want to let you know that the essays are I'm working on them. They will be done this week. That was kind of taking my focus, and then like I said, I got my second vaccine, and that just kind of knocked me out for 2 days. Um, it wasn't really bad. It was really tough to focus, and it was just kind of fatigued and um, just wasn't getting a lot of work done, if really any at all. So kind of threw me for a loop that I wasn't fully expecting. But back at it this week. So I'm going to go ahead and answer your questions, and please let me know if I don't do a good job at explaining or answering these. So these are just the questions that I took from the discussion, and these are all the ones that I saw. So if you have other questions you'd like to ask me, let me know. These are for both of my 102 sections. So Gracie asks, to better understand this assignment, I looked up two keywords, ethnography research and discourse community. And she says ethnography research, she wants to know if these are correct interpretations of the key terms. So she says ethnography research is a type of research used to observe a community or person in their natural environment for the researcher to understand the mindset and rationale behind the community or person's actions more in depth. The details and different definitions of a discourse community are still providing me confusion. However, I do understand that a discourse community is generally described by people with similar thought processes on a variety of topics and situations. So, yes, I can say that your definition of ethnography is perfectly correct. That's my dog coming in. Perfectly correct. But it is exactly that. You're essentially observing a community in their natural environment to understand who they are, what they do, what drives them, what motivates them, understanding things like are there stereotypes uh, associated with this community that when you are researching the community maybe don't apply. Um, the discourse community aspect of it is really is our focus. So specifically, we're talking about not just any community, although that kind of does apply. We're really referring more to how that community communicates with one another. So they kind of go hand in hand. They're almost identical in terms of what a regular community is and a discourse community. But a discourse community is referring to the discourse or the language and communication of that community. So your focus for this assignment really has to do with the communication efforts of that community. Not so much, not always, like, for instance, some ethnographies will focus on things like the daily activities, um, the the habitat itself, the living arrangements, and expectations of living in that group. But our focus, because it's an English class, is really about the communication efforts of that community. So you can address those other things, like the habitat that they live in or operate in, but it's really about how they communicate in that habitat, or how they communicate with one another, or what channels or media or genres they use to communicate, what language they use to communicate, what types of publications or communiques do they produce. Some of you said Alcoholics Anonymous as a discourse community. They have a book called The Big Book, and it's one that they all kind of share and talk about because it's the founders' sort of memoir and experience of becoming sober. So that's one form of communication that they use, but they also communicate orally through dialogue and group discussion, because those meetings are typically people get together and they just talk about their experiences and what they're going through trying to get sober. So that's what we're talking about. You like if you're choosing something like Alcoholics Anonymous, you don't necessarily have to spend a bulk of the essay describing what an alcoholic is and what Alcoholics Anonymous is. That will make up some of the essay, but the focus is on what are they communicating, how are they communicating, what stereotypes might there be about that communication or who they are? How do they communicate their identity to the world and to each other? So that's the key difference for our assignment. But that was a great question, Gracie. Thank you for asking that. Cooper says, my only question about the ethnographic research piece so far is, will we be selecting a group, organization, or location ourselves? As in, are there any limits or restrictions as to what we can research and make our piece about? So I noticed that you did kind of figure that out later in your discussion, Cooper, but I will just go ahead and answer this directly. The choice is ultimately up to you. Some of this will need to be about feasibility. So what groups can you actually integrate yourself into, whether it's an online community or local community, especially with safety precautions right now during the shutdown. So there's not really any limits or restrictions per se. It's just, you know, what are you able to accomplish in this 6 weeks? Who are you able to integrate yourself with? Uh, who are you able to interview and talk to and observe in that amount of time, and do that safely? So just keep that in mind. But really anything, and you can take ideas from other students. And like I said, several people have chosen Alcoholics Anonymous, which could be that people were just like, yeah, I'll pick that one because that person picked it. That's okay. Just be careful with collaborating on this effort. Ian, one of my Ians asks, says, I'm confused about the putting ourselves inside the group. Are we supposed to join some sort of internet group? So the idea of embedding yourself really just means, traditionally, it means you would go and sort of either just observe this group. So if anyone's seen the show or the movie Midsummer, um, these like anthropologists are going to this midsummer event in this other country to observe the rites and rituals of this midsummer festival that happens like once every 75 years, something like that. And so they like go into the community, they participate and observe and take notes about what's going on and their own experiences. You obviously don't have the same amount of time and resources to do that. The idea behind this project is you're just finding a community that you can kind of sit in on maybe a couple meetings or observe their communication online. A lot of people last semester chose internet communities, either on Reddit or other types of forums online, and it worked out great. I had a student write about the Tulpa community, Tulpamancy. She found an online forum and basically posted all of her questions to the forum, and a bunch of users responded to those questions about their community. And then she was also able to see like different topical threads that people talk about in the Topomancy community. Um, so it may be just observing the way a forum runs online, and that's perfectly fine as long as you're interacting with those community members in some way, and getting their permission to observe and write about them. Or it could be going out to the community itself. For the AA people, I know that there are local communities, local chapters, and local meetings that they could go to. And I actually talked to someone about that the other day, where you could attend a Zoom session or go to one of these community centers or churches where they're having these meetings and sit in and listen. Again, as long as you have permission to do so. You don't need to participate necessarily unless you want to. That's not a super specific requirement. Some students are able to do that depending on uh, what they're observing. I had a student last semester observe a Christian community, and she went to a meeting and was just sort of sharing some of her experiences. But that was considered participating because that's what the meeting involved. Uh, okay, Sylvie asks, she says, I'm not confused about any part of the assignment so far, but a student sample of the ethnographic essay could be helpful if that's possible. The student samples for the cluster analysis were extremely helpful in just showing what the final product would look like and what is expected from us. Yes, I do have them. Last semester was the first time I taught this assignment. I have 2 or 3 suites, I think. So I have actually like their plan of action, the annotated bibliography, and the essay itself. So I want to roll that out to you with this video, so that you will have that on board. They are they're good. They're some of the best that I had. I'm still developing what this assignment can and should be, and it was kind of difficult to do during the pandemic. So the I will have higher expectations in the future, but these are really good samples to get us started, and like I said, some of the best of the semester. So those will be available with this video. Charles, I'm not really confused about anything, but I think I could better understand the ethnography a little more than I do. Okay, so that wasn't very specific about what you could understand better. But again, the gist really is about just observing a community of people and noticing how they communicate. What do they communicate? What do they talk about? How do they talk about it? What means do they use to communicate? If it's an online community, for instance, they probably have rules. Like in Reddit, I showed this in the other video. They have rules in the subreddits uh, in order to engage one another, right? Sometimes it's like you can't shitpost, um, you can't share ads, you can't do this or that, and then it encourages other forms of communication. So those rules, for instance, are expectations of the group, right? That you could observe and take notes on. But then how members are communicating. So for instance, in that other video I shared at the beginning of the unit, I talk about how, some groups may maybe communicate more so through memes. Other groups may communicate more so through text uh, and longer paragraphs. So that's something you would notice. I think in that one I showed you like the liberal versus conservative subreddits, and notice like how the rules are different, how the communication is different, and the topics are different, and then how they also address similar topics as well can be different. So I would my best advice on this is, Charles, is to just reach out to me personally, and we can kind of chat one on one, so I can get a better sense of maybe where you're confused and what you could do to kind of grasp the concept of ethnography a little bit more. It's not as scary as it sounds. I think the word ethnography is something that most of you have not encountered before, so it's very new, which can be a little frightening at times. But it's pretty straightforward once you kind of get the hang of it. Jesse says you're having trouble picking discourse community to observe and write about. So really my advice on this is just finding a community that you don't really know anything about, but you're curious to know more. I had a student, for instance, choose tulpomancy last semester, which if you don't know, I mean, the really colloquial simplified version of this is a community that creates what we may refer to as imaginary friends, although it's much more nuanced and complex than that. But a tulpa is essentially a Tibetan thought form. And so they didn't know much about this community. They were just interested to know why adults would feel the need to have imaginary friends, as she put it. But then she learned a lot about the community, that in fact, it wasn't so much like an imaginary friend as it was, for some people, it was a coping mechanism. For others, it was a way to kind of organize their world and sort of create something that they could talk to about certain topics that they couldn't talk to about other people. So maybe they were in a community um, where people engaged in very specific topics, and maybe some things that they were interested in, he or she could not engage with that community in. So they created this uh, tulpa to engage with and try to kind of create a dialogue with themselves, essentially, but through this other person. And in fact, the student actually found out that most of these people were just average run-of-the-mill people that had a large social network of friends and community members and colleagues, but they just found solace in creating tulpas, and the community was really engaged with that type of behavior. That was actually um, most of the members' experiences, that they were all actually had friends in a large social network, but they were using tulpas for these other reasons. So like I said, pick something that really interests you, that you're just curious about, want to know more about. Tori says, I think the only thing that is confusing for me at this time is what community I will study for the essay. I'm wondering if I can study therapists at work for my job. I'm not part of their community per se. However, we do work for the same company in the same building. I feel, however, studying them would give me a better understanding of what all their job entails, since that is my ultimate goal. So you said therapist. I'm assuming you mean therapists, plural, because you reference, um, you said them. So that can be appropriate. I think the only concern is, where are you, how are you going to witness them communicating with one another, or talking with one another? So you would be able to interview those people individually for sure. But I would definitely reach out to them and ask, is there a place where therapists get together and talk about these things, or is there something that you could observe where you are talking? Um, Now, mostly, I would say that is probably happening in academic journals, where they're sharing research and case studies on patients. So that would probably be where a majority of that discourse community engages one another. So just be aware of that. That might involve some heavy reading on your end. Um, so something to keep in mind is, it needs to be a community that you can observe talking to one another or writing to one another in a way that's manageable. So I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but you might run into some issues with how they're communicating. Danielle says, I'm not sure what discourse community I would like to do my research on, possibly the panhandlers we see out around Hagerstown on a daily basis, but I'm not positive on that yet. I would not encourage that for two reasons. Number one, a panhandler is part of a community in the way that just an alcoholic is part of a community, meaning that they're not necessarily engaging other panhandlers. They're not, um, I don't think there's conventions for that type of thing. And that's also probably really dangerous, which is my second more important point. I would not engage people on the street. I'm not going to encourage you to do that for this assignment. If you feel that that's something you would like to do, okay, I'm not going to encourage it um, as the instructor, and I would try to encourage you to do something that is a little bit more manageable and maybe a little safer, because you don't, you know. But ultimately, I think for the topic itself, because I try not to discourage topics, for the topic itself, I'm struggling to figure out how you're observing panhandlers communicating with one another. Obviously, you'd be able to observe them panhandling on the street, but are where are they communicating and congregating that you're able to safely observe them and communicate with them? So that would be my concern there. Sean says, I'm not sure what to write about. I'm also not sure of what I do not belong in. I was thinking about talking about the discourse communities of African Americans and the things they go through. I'm not sure if it is a valid topic, though. Please let me know. So, a couple things here. Technically, yes, African Americans and people of color are part of a discourse community. However, there is an issue of sort of blanketing an entire community of people of color as one community. They're not monolithic, meaning that a community of people of color in this area is not representative of the community of people of color in all areas. So I would try to figure out a way to narrow your focus down a little bit. I think I understand the topic from the perspective of what it's like to be Black in America. Not personally, obviously, but just there are obviously a lot of online communities and local communities, like Black Lives Matter, that discuss this. So you could, for instance, decide to look at the Black Lives Matter community on an online forum or subreddit, um, or other social media, or if there's local chapters meeting. That would be certainly appropriate, because that's a particular movement, it's a particular group. They definitely communicate with one another. Um, I would just be careful about, because the goal here is to not stereotype a group. So you don't want to go in stereotyping a group and saying that, I'm just going to talk about all African Americans. But I do take your concern, um, that you're a little unsure of what groups you can and can't write about. So I would say something like the Black Lives Matter movement would be a good option because it's much more specific, and it is a community in and of itself that isn't just made up by people of color. There are people of all races that are involved in that movement, but obviously it is about Black lives. So if you have further questions on that, though, let me know. And then the last one I got a couple questions from Chris. So he says, I have multiple questions pertaining to this particular unit. Number one, what exactly are we supposed to be taking notes on when in our communities? I see that there are guiding questions on the essay assignment. So are we mainly answering these questions for our notes? How are we supposed to take these notes on a community using the various methods of access? Example, social media versus Zoom meetings, versus online community. So yes, to your question, that those guiding questions I gave you should definitely guide the notes that you take. You will not be able to answer probably all of those questions, and I don't expect you to, and that would be a boring essay if you're just answering every single question. But they're there as a guide. Those are things that you can think about and things that you can look out for as you're observing the community. Ultimately, though, those what you take notes on is really up to you and what you're finding interesting. Sometimes if you go into one community versus another, there might be a bunch of questions that you can answer when observing this community, but you can't answer when observing this community, or some questions that are more interesting when observing this community than when observing this other community. So it's not about checking off those boxes of questions, like you have to do all of it. It's really about, those are just there to guide you. So when you get into the community and you're looking around, just look for common themes and trends and ideas and discussion topics that they're talking about. Look at the way that they're engaging one another. Is it orally? Is it through text? Is it through images? Is it through videos and memes, or a mixture of all these things? Are there specific publications that they produce? Black Lives Matter, for instance, that I mentioned, depending on the chapter and area that you live in, they probably have pamphlets and flyers and social media groups where they get this information out to local members. So what you're taking notes on is ultimately what you're observing. It can be exactly what you're observing in any situation, but everybody's group and the notes they take are going to be different because the groups are going to be different and how they communicate is going to be different. Two, I know that Chris, you had asked me this directly, but how are we supposed to interview people when using social media or an online method of accessing a community? How many people should we interview? So I wanted to address that here, even though we had already talked about this one-on-one, because it is a really great question. The interviews can be one-on-one. They can either be on Zoom or face-to-face. They can be through email, so you can email questions to a person and they can respond, or over the phone. You can do this through a forum. So I've had, like, the student that wrote about the Tulpa community asked the moderator if she could post these questions for her project and got permission from the moderators to do so. The moderator let the group members know what was happening beforehand, and then the student posted the questions to a forum, and several users answered those questions. So that's actually a really effective way. One of the nice things about the online communities is you can reach more people with those interview questions. So the interview is sort of loose. It's not like a Gayle King interview, or a 60 Minutes interview per se. It's like just you're trying to ask specific and guided questions to community members. So you can be creative about that, but it should be interview questions that you ask and those people answer. It should not be interviews you found online. Those are sources you can use, but they're not interviews that you conducted. So just keep that in mind. And three, while it was said that pamphlets or posts would count as, sorry, there's 3 and 4. 3, while it was said that pamphlets or posts would count as primary source material, what else constitutes as primary source materials? So anything that the group produces, if it's a website, if it's their social media page, if it's a tweet or a meme or an image or a video or their own interview or a music video or a song, like anything produced by that group or individual members of that group is a primary source because it comes directly from the group. So anything that they have that you want to showcase in terms of their communication between group members. So for instance, on a subreddit, if they have community rules and there's like 5 community rules, that is a primary source. That is something that was published and created by the community for the community to be used by the community and for the community. And those rules are a separate entity from the discussions themselves in the community itself. It's an actual product that they've made. So those rules would be a primary source. For Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps that are posted on the board at every meeting, that is a primary source. The big book, the memoir by the founder, that is a primary source. And 4, where can I look to see an example of a student's work or an online example of a person's work in each step of the process of an ethnography? So like I said, to an earlier question, I have posted these with this video, so you can kind of get a sense of that progression. I'm still building these materials, so they're not the best, but they're the best that I have for now. This is still a work in progress type of assignment. So, we can just keep communicating with one another about any hiccups you might run into along the way. I think this, again, will be easier to do when pandemic restrictions have been lifted, although I think that the online community engagement is a really useful ethnography topic. So even though there might be some hiccups along the way, I think this is still a really fun and engaging assignment. Let me know if anybody has ideas or thoughts on any of this, or if you have other questions. I'm here. I'm going to try to stay a little bit more on top of grading now. So getting caught up, those will be back to you very shortly.